I was supposed to be getting better. That's what Dr. Martinez had told me 3 days earlier, when I'd finally dragged myself to the clinic, my chest rattling with every breath and my fever spiking to dangerous levels. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pneumonia, he'd said, handing me a prescription for antibiotics and strict orders for bed rest. But as I stood shivering in the parking lot of Pine Ridge Lodge at 7,000 feet above sea level, watching my boyfriend Jake load our hiking gear with an enthusiasm that made my lungs burn just watching him, I realized that getting better was the last thing on his mind. "Emma, you sure you're up for this?" Jake called out, though his tone suggested he'd already decided the answer for me. His breath came out in white puffs in the morning air, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my aching body. The elevation was already making me dizzy, and we hadn't even started the trail yet. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have listened to the voice in my head that had been whispering warnings for weeks now. But love makes you stupid sometimes, and I'd been stupidly in love with Jake Morrison for 2 years. Stupid enough to ignore the way he'd been hovering over my shoulder when I'd gotten the call about my grandmother's estate being finalized. Stupid enough to dismiss how quickly he'd suggested this healing retreat to the mountains the moment he'd overheard the lawyer mention the inheritance amount. The morning that changed everything had started like any other, except for the fact that I could barely breathe without feeling like someone was pressing hot coals against my ribs. I'd been fighting this infection for over a week, and despite the antibiotics, I felt worse than ever. My apartment in downtown Portland felt stuffy and small, and when Jake had burst through my door that Tuesday morning with coffee and what he called the perfect solution, I'd been too weak to argue. "Fresh mountain air, babe," he'd said, setting the coffee on my nightstand and perching on the edge of my bed like he was delivering life-saving news. "My buddy Ryan has this cabin near Mount Hood. It's gorgeous up there, and you know what they say about altitude and healing. Plus, you've been cooped up in this place for days." I'd tried to protest, reminding him that Dr. Martinez had specifically said rest, warmth, and avoiding strenuous activity. But Jake had this way of making everything sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. He'd always been persuasive, one of the qualities that had drawn me to him when we'd met at a conference for nonprofit workers. I'd been presenting on sustainable community development, and he'd approached me afterward with questions that showed he'd actually been listening. That attention had felt intoxicating after years of dating men who seemed more interested in their phones than in anything I had to say. "Emma, you're a project coordinator for an environmental organization," he'd continued that morning, running his fingers through my tangled hair. "You spend all day thinking about nature and fresh air and getting people outdoors. When's the last time you actually practiced what you preach?" The guilt trip had worked, just like it always did. Jake had this talent for making me feel like I was somehow failing at being myself if I didn't go along with his plans. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he'd been building that dynamic, how systematically he'd been training me to second-guess my own instincts. But at the time, lying there with my chest on fire and my head pounding, it had seemed easier to just say yes. The drive up to the mountains had been torture. Every bump in the road sent shockwaves through my already aching body, and the increasing elevation made my ears pop and my breathing even more labored. Jake had kept the music loud and the conversation light, pointing out landmarks and talking about how amazing it would be to disconnect from the city for a few days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He'd seemed almost manic with excitement, which I'd attributed to his love of outdoor adventures. Jake was one of those people who came alive in nature, who could spend hours hiking trails that would leave me exhausted even when I was healthy. But there had been something else in his enthusiasm that morning, something that made my skin crawl even through my fever-induced haze. Every time his phone buzzed, he'd glance at it with this secretive smile, like he was receiving updates on some private joke. When I'd asked about it, he'd waved me off, saying it was just work stuff. Jake worked in insurance, handling large estate and life insurance claims, and he was always getting calls at odd hours. I'd learned not to pry into the details of his job because he'd always made it sound mind-numbingly boring whenever I'd tried to show interest. The cabin Jake had borrowed turned out to be more of a hunting lodge, rustic and isolated, perched on a hillside that offered stunning views of the Cascade Range, but zero cell phone reception. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the access road was barely more than a dirt track that wound through dense forest. Under normal circumstances, I might have found it romantic. But as Jake carried our bags inside and immediately started talking about the hiking trails we could explore, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Jake, I really don't think I should be hiking," I'd managed to say, collapsing onto the couch in front of the massive stone fireplace. "I can barely make it up a flight of stairs right now." He'd looked at me with that patient expression he got whenever he thought I was being unreasonable. "Emma, you've been breathing recycled city air for weeks. What you need is to get your blood pumping, get some real oxygen into your lungs. I'm not talking about anything extreme, just some gentle walks on the easier trails." The first night had been miserable. The cabin was drafty, and despite Jake building a fire that he kept feeding throughout the evening, I couldn't seem to get warm. My cough had gotten worse, deep and wet and painful, and I'd spent most of the night sitting up because lying down made me feel like I was drowning. Jake had offered to drive me back to town, but in that tone that suggested he really hoped I wouldn't take him up on it. Instead, he'd made me tea and rubbed my back and promised that I'd feel better in the morning after a good night's sleep at altitude. But morning had brought no relief, only a worsening of my symptoms, and Jake's increasingly insistent suggestions that we needed to get me moving. He'd made breakfast and presented me with a detailed map of the area, pointing out what he claimed were easy trails that would be perfect for someone recovering. The trails he'd circled led deep into the wilderness, far from any roads or ranger stations, through terrain that would be challenging even for someone in perfect health. That's when the first real wave of unease had hit me. Not just the physical discomfort of being sick, but something deeper and more instinctual. The way Jake's eyes lit up when he talked about getting me out on those remote trails. The way he'd packed our gear the night before, including supplies that seemed excessive for what he'd described as gentle day hikes. The way he kept checking his phone despite claiming there was no service, smiling at messages I couldn't see. I tried to call my sister Rebecca from the landline Jake claimed was broken, but when I'd picked up the receiver, there had been a dial tone. When I'd mentioned this to Jake, he'd shrugged and said it must be intermittent, something about mountain phone lines being unreliable. But I'd noticed he'd unplugged the cord from the wall jack when he thought I wasn't looking. The second morning had brought snow, light at first, then steadily heavier as the day progressed. I'd woken up feeling worse than ever, my fever higher and my breathing so labored that each breath felt like a conscious effort. But Jake had been more excited than I'd ever seen him, practically bouncing around the cabin as he prepared our gear for what he called a, quote, winter wonderland adventure. "This is perfect, Em," he'd said, stuffing extra layers and emergency supplies into our backpacks. "Fresh snow, clear air, and nobody else on the trails. It'll be like having the whole mountain to ourselves." I'd protested weakly, pointing out that hiking in snow while sick with pneumonia seemed like exactly the kind of thing that could kill someone. But Jake had already committed us to the plan in his mind, and he'd developed this habit over the months we'd been together of treating my concerns like character flaws I needed to overcome. He'd made it sound like staying in the cabin was the coward's choice, like I was letting my illness control my life instead of fighting back against it. The manipulation had been so subtle, so carefully crafted, that I'd actually started to feel guilty for not wanting to risk my life on a snowy mountain trail. That's how good Jake was at twisting reality, at making his reckless ideas sound like wisdom, and my reasonable fears sound like weakness. He'd spent months training me to doubt my own judgment, and by the time we'd strapped on our snowshoes and headed out into the storm, I'd almost convinced myself that he was right. The trail Jake had chosen wound steadily upward through dense forest, following a creek that gurgled beneath a skin of ice. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that stuck to everything and made the world feel muffled and surreal. My breathing was ragged within the first half-mile, and I had to stop frequently to rest, leaning against trees and trying to clear the fluid that seemed to be gathering in my lungs. Jake had seemed almost energized by my struggles, offering encouragement that felt increasingly hollow as we climbed higher into the wilderness. He'd taken photos of me struggling through the snow, claiming he wanted to document my brave recovery journey, but there had been something in his expression when he'd looked at those photos that had made my blood run cold, like he was documenting something else entirely. We'd been hiking for over 2 hours when I'd realized I couldn't go any further. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, and the combination of fever and altitude was making me so dizzy I could barely stay upright. I'd collapsed onto a fallen log, gasping for air and trying not to panic as my vision started to gray around the edges. "Jake," I'd managed to whisper, "I need to go back. Something's wrong." He'd looked at me with what I'd first thought was concern, but as I'd studied his face more carefully, I'd realized it was something else entirely. Something calculating and cold and patient, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "We're almost there, Em," he'd said, checking his GPS device with the kind of focus someone might give to a complicated recipe. "Just another mile or so to the overlook. You've come this far, don't give up now." But I'd known with sudden, terrifying clarity that there was no overlook, at least not one we were planning to return from together. The way he'd been watching me struggle, the way he'd seemed to anticipate exactly how the day would unfold, the way he'd been so prepared with supplies he'd never mentioned needing before. It had all been planned, every step of it, from the moment he'd learned about my inheritance. That's when I'd started to understand that the man I'd been in love with for 2 years had been planning to kill me, and I was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to make it look like an accident. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins, cutting through the fever haze with shocking clarity. Jake wasn't trying to help me recover. He was trying to make sure I never recovered at all. Every encouraging word, every gentle push to keep going higher into the wilderness, every dismissal of my symptoms had been calculated to get me exactly where I was now, alone with him, miles from help, too sick to defend myself or find my way back. I tried to keep my face neutral as the pieces fell into place, fighting the urge to confront him directly. My grandmother's estate had been worth more than I'd ever expected when the lawyer had called last month. $3.2 million, mostly from property investments she'd made decades ago that had appreciated beyond anyone's imagination. I'd been shocked by the amount, but Jake had been even more interested than I was. He'd asked detailed questions about the timeline for probate, about beneficiary requirements, about what would happen to the money if something happened to me before the estate was fully settled. At the time, I'd thought he was just being practical, maybe even sweet in his concern for my future security. Now I understood he'd been conducting research, figuring out exactly how much my life was worth, and what he'd need to do to claim it. We'd been living together for 8 months, and 6 months ago he'd suggested we get life insurance policies naming each other as beneficiaries. He'd made it sound romantic, like a symbol of our commitment to building a future together. I'd signed the papers without reading them carefully, trusting him to handle the details because insurance was his area of expertise. The policy had been for $500,000, which had seemed like an enormous amount at the time. But now, sitting on that log with snow collecting on my shoulders and my breathing getting more labored by the minute, I realized that $500,000 plus $3.2 million was enough money to make murder look like love. "Emma, we really should keep moving," Jake said, shouldering his pack with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested he wasn't struggling with the altitude or exertion at all. "The weather's getting worse and we want to make it to the shelter before dark." I hadn't heard him mention any shelter before, and the way he said it made my skin crawl. There was something rehearsed about his tone, like he'd practiced this conversation. I managed to stand up, my legs shaking with the effort, and tried to think clearly despite the fog in my brain. If I was right about his intentions, then going deeper into the wilderness with him was suicide. But if I was wrong, if this really was just his misguided attempt to help me feel better, then refusing to continue would damage our relationship in ways I might not be able to repair. The doubt was almost worse than the fear. Jake had spent months conditioning me to question my own judgment, to defer to his expertise and trust his decisions even when they didn't feel right. Even now, with every instinct screaming danger, part of me wondered if I was being paranoid, if the fever and medication were making me imagine threats that didn't exist. But then I caught him checking his phone again, and I saw the screen clearly for the first time. Full bars of service, despite his claims that we were in a dead zone. He'd been receiving and sending messages all day, staying in contact with someone while letting me believe we were completely isolated. The betrayal of that small lie suddenly made all the bigger lies visible, like tearing away a curtain I hadn't even realized was there. "Jake," I said carefully, "maybe we should head back to the cabin. I'm feeling pretty rough, and this snow is getting heavy." He looked at me with that patient expression again, but underneath it, I caught a flash of something that looked like irritation. "Emma, You're always feeling rough lately. That's why we're out here, remember? To get you past this mindset where every little ache and pain becomes an excuse to give up. The cruelty of it took my breath away. I was fighting pneumonia, struggling to breathe at altitude in a snowstorm, and he was framing my desire to survive as a character weakness. It was gaslighting so smooth and practiced that I almost fell for it again, almost apologized for being sick and agreed to keep walking toward whatever he had planned for me in the wilderness. Instead, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I lied. "You're right," I said, forcing a smile that hurt my face. "I'm being dramatic. Let me just sit here for a few more minutes to catch my breath, and then we can keep going." Jake's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he set his pack down with the air of someone whose plan was back on track. "That's my girl. You know what? Why don't I scout ahead a little bit, just to see how much further we have to go? The trail gets tricky up ahead, and I want to make sure we take the safest route." He wanted to scout ahead, which meant he wanted to leave me alone, weak and disoriented, in a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere. The shelter he'd mentioned was probably fictional, just another lie to keep me moving in the direction he wanted. I nodded weakly, playing the part of the compliant girlfriend who trusted him completely. "That sounds good," I managed. "I'll just rest here and try to warm up a little." Jake kissed my forehead, a gesture that would have seemed loving if I hadn't noticed the way his eyes stayed cold and calculating above his smile. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most. Don't wander off, okay? It's easy to get lost up here." The irony wasn't lost on me. He was warning me not to get lost while actively trying to make sure I never found my way home again. I watched him disappear into the swirling snow, his bright red jacket becoming a blur and then vanishing entirely among the trees. The moment I was certain he was gone, I stood up with more energy than I'd felt all day, adrenaline cutting through the fever like a shot of pure caffeine. Whatever he was planning, whatever he'd told whoever he'd been texting, I had maybe 30 minutes to figure out how to survive it. The first thing I did was check my own phone, confirming what I'd suspected when I'd seen his screen. Full service, 5 bars, perfect reception. He'd been lying about the dead zone, probably to prevent me from calling for help or letting anyone know where we were. I immediately tried to call Rebecca, but the call went straight to voicemail. She was probably at work, in a meeting or with a client, with her phone silenced. I left a message anyway, trying to keep my voice steady despite the panic rising in my throat. "Becca, it's Emma. I'm in trouble. I'm somewhere on Mount Hood with Jake, and I think he's trying to hurt me. I'm gonna try to get back to the cabin, but if something happens to me, you need to know that this wasn't an accident. Check his phone records. Check his insurance policies. Check everything. I love you." Then I called 911, but the dispatcher couldn't get a clear location from my GPS coordinates, and when I tried to describe where we were, I realized I had no idea what trail we'd taken or how to direct rescue workers to find me. The best I could do was give them Jake's contact information and the general area where we'd started hiking, but with the snow getting heavier and visibility dropping, I knew they wouldn't be able to launch any kind of search until the weather cleared. I was on my own, sick and weak and miles from safety, with a man who apparently wanted me dead heading back in my direction any minute now. The smart thing would have been to try to retrace our steps, to follow our tracks back down the mountain toward the cabin, but our footprints were already being covered by fresh snow, and I knew from experience that Jake was a much stronger hiker than I was. Even with my head start, he'd catch up to me easily if I tried to go back the way we'd come. Instead, I did something that felt completely insane, but might have been the only thing that could save me. I left the trail. I'd grown up camping with my family, and my father had drilled basic wilderness survival into me from an early age. One of the things he'd taught me was that if you're being pursued by someone, you don't run in the direction they expect you to go. You make yourself harder to find, not easier to follow. I took a moment to study Jake's map, which he'd left in his pack when he'd gone to scout ahead, and I identified a different trail that branched off about a quarter-mile back down the mountain. If I could reach it without him seeing me, I might be able to circle around toward a different trailhead, one that would bring me out closer to the ranger station instead of the isolated cabin. It was a desperate plan, and probably a stupid one, but staying put felt like suicide, and trying to outrun him on his chosen route felt impossible. I grabbed the emergency supplies from his pack including the first aid kit, emergency blanket, and water purification tablets, and I started moving as quickly as my compromised lungs would allow. The snow was working in my favor now, muffling my footsteps and obscuring my tracks almost as quickly as I made them. But it was also making everything more dangerous, turning rocks into slippery hazards, and hiding obstacles that could easily trip me or twist an ankle. I forced myself to move carefully despite my desperation to put distance between myself and the place where Jake expected to find me. I'd made it maybe 200 yards when I heard him calling my name. His voice carried easily through the snowy air, and there was a note of barely controlled panic in it that told me everything I needed to know about what he'd planned to do when he got back. Finding me gone hadn't been part of his script. Emma, where are you?" The concern in his voice was perfectly performed, exactly how a worried boyfriend should sound when his sick girlfriend had wandered off in a blizzard. But I could hear the undertone of anger, the frustration of someone whose carefully laid plans had just been derailed. I pressed myself against a large pine tree, trying to control my breathing and my coughing, praying that the snow would muffle any sound I made. Through the swirling white, I could see his red jacket moving through the trees, searching in widening circles around the spot where he'd left me. He was being systematic about it, methodical, like someone with experience tracking things that didn't want to be found. That's when I remembered what Jake had told me about his job, the stories he'd shared about investigating insurance fraud, about tracking down people who were trying to disappear with money that didn't belong to them. He'd made it sound boring and bureaucratic, but now I realized he'd probably developed real skills at finding people who didn't want to be found. Skills he was about to use to hunt me down in the wilderness. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I nearly dropped it in my haste to silence the sound. The message was from Jake, sent just moments ago despite the fact that I could still hear him calling my name less than 100 yards away. "Emma, I'm worried about you. This weather is getting dangerous. Text me back so I know you're okay." The casual tone of it, the performance of concern for anyone who might later read our message history, made my blood run cold. He was already building his alibi, creating a record that would show how hard he tried to keep me safe when my body was eventually found frozen in the woods. I turned off my phone completely, knowing that he could probably track its location if it stayed on, and I kept moving through the trees. The branch trail I was looking for should be coming up soon, marked by a wooden sign that would hopefully still be visible despite the snow. My lungs were burning with every breath, and I could feel fluid rattling in my chest with each step, but the alternative to keeping moving was dying, and I wasn't ready to give Jake that satisfaction. Behind me, his calls were getting more frequent and more urgent. He'd probably found our original resting spot by now, seen that I'd taken supplies from his pack, realized that my disappearance wasn't random wandering but deliberate escape. The pretense of being a concerned boyfriend was starting to crack, and I could hear real anger creeping into his voice. "Emma, this isn't funny anymore. You're gonna get yourself killed out here." The irony would have been laughable if I weren't fighting for my life. He was warning me about the exact thing he'd brought me up here to accomplish, just not in the way he'd originally planned. My escape had forced him to improvise, and improvisation meant mistakes, meant evidence, meant witnesses who might later question his story about the tragic accident that befell his sick girlfriend during a well-intentioned healing retreat. I found the trail marker buried in snow and nearly collapsed with relief. The wooden sign was weathered and partially obscured, but I could make out enough letters to confirm that this was the Cascade Creek Trail, which, according to Jake's map, would loop around the mountain and eventually connect with the main access road about 3 miles from the ranger station. 3 miles felt like 30 in my current condition, but it was possible, and more importantly, it was a route Jake wouldn't expect me to know about. The new trail was narrower and less maintained than the one we'd been following, which meant it would be harder for him to track me, but also more dangerous for someone in my condition to navigate alone. I didn't have a choice. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, no longer bothering to call my name, just searching with the grim efficiency of a predator who'd lost sight of his prey but knew it couldn't have gone far. I started down the Cascade Creek Trail, moving as quickly as I dared, trying to put distance between myself and the man I'd loved and trusted and lived with for almost a year. The man who'd been planning my murder with the same careful attention to detail he brought to everything else in his life. Every step took me further from the immediate danger, but also deeper into a wilderness that could kill me just as effectively as Jake could, and probably more slowly. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature was dropping as afternoon faded toward evening. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and then I'd be trying to navigate unfamiliar trails in the dark, sick and exhausted and running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate will to survive. I'd taken Jake's emergency supplies, but I didn't have his experience or his physical strength, and I was fighting an infection that was getting worse with every hour I spent in the cold mountain air. But I was alive, and I was free, and for the first time in months, I was making my own decisions about my own survival. Whatever happened next, I was going to face it on my own terms, not as the victim of someone else's greed and betrayal. Behind me, the forest had gone quiet. Either Jake had given up the immediate search, or he'd gotten smart about moving silently through the woods. I didn't know which possibility scared me more. I kept walking, one painful step at a time, into the gathering darkness of the mountains, and the uncertain promise of whatever lay ahead. The Cascade Creek Trail descended sharply through a series of switchbacks that would have been challenging even for a healthy hiker. With pneumonia compromising my breathing and the snow making every surface treacherous, each step felt like a gamble with gravity. I had to stop frequently to rest against trees, pressing my burning chest against the rough bark and trying to clear the fluid that seemed to be accumulating faster as I exerted myself in the thin mountain air. The silence behind me was almost worse than Jake's calling had been. At least when he was shouting my name, I knew where he was and what he was doing. Now the forest felt full of invisible threats, every crack of a branch or whisper of wind through the pines making me freeze and listen for footsteps that might be following. The snow continued to fall in thick, wet flakes that stuck to everything and made the world feel muffled and dreamlike, as if I were moving through someone else's nightmare instead of living my own. I'd been walking for almost an hour when I came across the first sign that I wasn't alone in these mountains. Boot prints in the snow, partially filled but still visible, leading down the same trail I was following. My heart hammered against my ribs as I knelt to examine them more closely, trying to determine if they belonged to Jake or to some other hiker who might represent either salvation or additional danger. The prints were smaller than Jake's size 11 boots, and the tread pattern was different from the hiking boots I'd seen him pack. Someone else had been on this trail recently, probably within the last few hours based on how much snow had accumulated in the impressions. The idea that there might be other people in the area filled me with a hope so intense it was almost painful. If I could catch up to whoever had made these tracks, I might find help, or at least witnesses who could complicate Jake's plans for making my death look accidental. But as I followed the prints down the mountain, they began to tell a different story. The stride length became uneven, and there were places where it looked like the person had stumbled or fallen. Drops of something dark stained the snow at irregular intervals, and when I knelt to examine one more closely, I realized with growing horror that it was blood. Someone else was injured and struggling on this trail, probably in as much trouble as I was. The rational part of my mind warned me that trying to help someone else when I could barely help myself was a dangerous distraction from my own survival. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that another person's emergency might be connected to mine, that Jake's plan might have involved more victims than just me. The blood trail led me off the main path toward what sounded like running water, probably the creek that gave the trail its name. As I pushed through a stand of young firs, their branches heavy with snow and scratching at my face and jacket, I saw a figure huddled beside the partially frozen stream. It was a woman, probably in her 50s, with graying hair that had escaped from under her knit cap, and a face pale with pain and exhaustion. She looked up when she heard me approaching, and I saw relief and wariness war in her expression. "Thank God," she whispered, then immediately followed with, "Are you alone?" The question sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Yes," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Are you hurt?" She gestured toward her left leg, which was stretched out in front of her at an unnatural angle. Even through her snow pants, I could see the obvious deformity of a broken bone. "Fell about 2 hours ago," she said through gritted teeth. "Heard someone coming up the trail and tried to get off the path to avoid them, but I slipped on some ice and went down hard." My throat constricted. "Someone coming up the trail?" Did you see who it was? She shook her head. Just heard voices, two men talking. Something about the timing being wrong, about having to change the plan. They sounded angry, and I don't know why, but something about their tone made me want to stay hidden. She studied my face more carefully. You look terrible, honey. Are you sick? I sank down beside her, suddenly too exhausted to keep standing. Pneumonia, I admitted. And I think the man I came up here with is trying to kill me. The words sounded insane, spoken out loud, like something from a made-for-TV movie rather than real life. But the woman didn't look skeptical or dismissive. Instead, her expression hardened with a recognition that suggested she'd encountered dangerous men before. What's his name? She asked. Jake Morrison. He works in insurance, handles estate claims. We've been together for 2 years, but I just inherited money from my grandmother, and now… I trailed off, realizing how paranoid I sounded. Now he's brought you to an isolated place where accidents happen, she finished grimly. I'm Carol, by the way. Carol Henderson. I'm a retired police detective, and honey, your story doesn't sound crazy to me at all. I've seen cases like this before. The validation was overwhelming. For months, Jake had been making me doubt my own perceptions, question my instincts, dismiss my concerns as anxiety or paranoia. Having someone with law enforcement experience take my fears seriously felt like being thrown a lifeline when I was already drowning. Those voices I heard, Carol continued, wincing as she tried to shift position. One of them mentioned something about insurance documentation and making sure the scene looked right. At the time, I thought they might be talking about some kind of accident reconstruction, but now… She looked at me with growing alarm. Emma, I think your boyfriend might not be working alone. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Not only was Jake planning to murder me, but he had help. Someone else was involved in the scheme. Someone who understood the technical details of making a death look accidental in a way that would satisfy insurance investigators and avoid arousing suspicion from law enforcement. We need to get out of here, I said, struggling to my feet. Both of us. Can you walk at all? Carol attempted to stand, but immediately collapsed back down with a cry of pain. Bones definitely broken, probably in multiple places. I'm not going anywhere without help. And even then… She looked up at me with the kind of clear-eyed assessment I imagined she'd used during her years as a detective. You're in no condition to carry me, and I'm too heavy for you to support even if you were healthy. She was right, and we both knew it. In my current state, trying to help her would probably just get us both killed. But the idea of leaving an injured woman alone in the mountains while Jake and his accomplice were somewhere in the area felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about human decency. What's your best advice? I asked. As someone who knows how these things work, Carol was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through options with the methodical approach of someone trained to make life-or-death decisions under pressure. You keep moving, she said finally. Get to the ranger station, get help, make sure there are official witnesses to your story before Jake has a chance to spin whatever narrative he's planned. I'll stay hidden here and try to survive until you can send rescue back for me. What if he finds you first? She reached into her jacket and pulled out something that made me gasp. A small revolver, snub-nosed and practical-looking. I didn't spend 30 years dealing with the worst of humanity without learning to protect myself, she said. I can't walk, but I can still shoot, and if your boyfriend or his friend comes looking for witnesses to eliminate, they're going to get a very unpleasant surprise. I stared at the gun, torn between relief that Carol could defend herself and terror at the confirmation that we were dealing with people willing to kill multiple victims to protect their scheme. How many bullets do you have? 6 in the cylinder, plus 12 more in my spare speed loader. Should be enough to handle 2 men, assuming I don't miss. Her smile was grim but determined. I've been retired for 5 years, but I still practice at the range twice a week. Muscle memory doesn't fade that fast. The knowledge that Carol was armed changed the entire dynamic of our situation. Instead of being 2 helpless victims waiting for rescue, we now had someone with law enforcement training who could serve as both witness and protector while I made my way to safety. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than anything I'd been able to come up with on my own. There's something else, Carol said, reaching into her other pocket. I managed to get some photos of those boot prints before the snow covered them too much. Different tread patterns, different sizes. If something happens to me, if they find me before you can get help back here, at least there will be some evidence that multiple people were involved. She handed me her phone, a newer model with a good camera and what looked like a full battery. The photos were clear and detailed, showing the distinctive patterns of at least 2 different types of hiking boots, along with measurements she'd made using her own boot for scale. It was exactly the kind of evidence a former detective would think to collect, and exactly the kind of documentation that could destroy Jake's story about a tragic accident befalling his sick girlfriend. "Keep the phone," she said when I tried to hand it back. "I've got a GPS beacon for emergencies, and honestly, you're going to need the evidence more than I need the convenience. Make sure you document everything from here on out. Every injury, every detail of how you got separated from Jake, every piece of his story that doesn't add up. Build a case while you're living through it, because if he's smart enough to plan something like this, he's smart enough to have prepared explanations for everything." I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket, right next to my own device that I was keeping powered down to avoid being tracked. "Carol, what if I don't make it? What if something happens to me before I can get help?" "Then I become the primary witness instead of the supporting one," she said matter-of-factly. "And I promise you, Emma, if that man kills you, he won't get away with it. I'll make sure of that, even if it's the last thing I do." The determination in her voice was both comforting and chilling. Here was a woman who understood exactly what we were dealing with, and was prepared to risk her own life to make sure justice was served. It gave me strength I didn't know I still had, enough to stand up and prepare to continue my desperate journey down the mountain. Before I left, Carol insisted on giving me a crash course in wilderness survival that might mean the difference between life and death over the next few hours. She explained how to recognize the signs of hypothermia and what to do if I started to feel confused or disoriented. She showed me how to use her emergency blanket most effectively, and how to find shelter if I couldn't make it all the way to the ranger station before dark. Most importantly, she taught me how to think like someone being hunted. "Don't just follow the obvious path," she said. "These men know the area, probably better than you do, and they'll expect you to take the most direct route to safety. Use the terrain to your advantage. Stay near water when you can, because streams are harder to track across and they'll mask your scent if they have dogs. Avoid open areas where you can be spotted from a distance. And whatever you do, don't use any lights after dark unless you absolutely have to. Night vision works both ways." As I prepared to leave, Carol grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Emma, listen to me carefully. When you get out of this, when you're safe and talking to the authorities, don't let them treat this as a domestic violence case or a crime of passion. This is organized, premeditated murder for financial gain. That means federal charges, serious prison time, and investigations that will uncover everyone involved. Make sure they understand the scope of what they're dealing with." I nodded, trying to memorize everything she'd told me, knowing that her expertise might be the only thing standing between me and becoming another unsolved missing person case in the mountains. As I turned to go, she called out one last piece of advice. "Trust your instincts, honey. They're what got you this far alive." The rest of the Cascade Creek Trail stretched out below me, disappearing into the swirling snow and gathering darkness. Somewhere behind me, Jake was probably still searching, possibly with help from whoever he'd been coordinating with throughout this nightmare. Somewhere ahead of me lay the promise of safety, if I could survive long enough to reach it. I started walking again, each step taking me further from the injured woman who'd become my unlikely ally, and deeper into the wilderness that might either save my life or claim it. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature was dropping fast as evening approached. My breathing was getting more labored, and I could feel my fever spiking again as the adrenaline that had been sustaining me began to fade. But I had hope now, real hope, based on evidence and expertise rather than just desperate optimism. Carol's photos were in my pocket, proof that multiple people had been involved in whatever was happening on this mountain. Her professional assessment had validated my fears and given me a framework for understanding the danger I was facing. Most importantly, her survival had created a witness, someone who could tell the story even if I didn't make it out alive. The trail curved sharply to the left, following the contours of the mountain as it descended toward the valley floor. Through the trees, I could see lights in the distance, probably the ranger station or maybe the small community that had grown up around the main trailhead access point. The lights seemed impossibly far away, but they were real and fixed, and represented safety in a way that made my chest tight with longing. I checked Carol's phone and saw that I had decent signal strength, despite being deep in the mountains. For a moment, I considered calling 911 again, but I remembered her advice about building a case while living through it. Instead, I opened the camera function and began documenting my condition, my location, and the circumstances that had led me to be alone and sick in the wilderness as night fell. The photos were brutal but necessary. My face was flushed with fever and drawn with exhaustion. My breathing was visibly labored, and when I recorded a short video, my voice was hoarse and strained in a way that clearly indicated serious illness. Most importantly, the timestamp and GPS coordinates would prove exactly when and where these recordings were made, creating a timeline that would be difficult for Jake to explain away. As I continued down the trail, I began to hear something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Voices, carried on the wind, calling my name. Not just Jake's voice this time, but at least one other person. Maybe two. They were behind me but getting closer, and they sounded organized, coordinated, like people conducting a systematic search rather than a panicked boyfriend looking for his missing girlfriend. I left the trail immediately, crashing through the underbrush toward the sound of running water. If Carol was right about streams being harder to track across, then Cascade Creek might be my best hope of losing them in the darkness. The water was ice-cold and knee-deep, but I waded in anyway, gasping at the shock of it and hoping that the current would wash away any scent trail I might be leaving. The voices were getting closer, and I could make out individual words now. Instructions about search patterns, discussions of timing, casual references to cleaning up the situation that left no doubt about their intentions. These weren't rescuers. These were predators, and I was their prey. I followed the creek downstream, staying in the water despite the cold that was already making my legs numb. Every step was agony, every breath a conscious effort, but the alternative was being found by men who wanted me dead. The water would hide my footprints and hopefully confuse any attempt to track me, buying me precious time to reach safety. Behind me, the voices were spreading out, covering more ground, getting systematically closer. I could hear Jake's voice among them, no longer bothering with the pretense of concern, just coldly directing the search like the business transaction he'd apparently always seen our relationship as being. I kept moving through the freezing water, one painful step at a time, toward the distant lights that represented my only hope of survival. The creek water felt like liquid ice against my legs, but I forced myself to keep wading downstream, using the rocky banks and overhanging branches to steady myself when the current threatened to knock me off balance. My pneumonia-ravaged lungs screamed with every breath of the frigid mountain air, and I could feel my core body temperature dropping dangerously low as the wet cold seeped through my clothes and into my bones. Behind me, the voices had grown more distant but no less determined. I could hear them splitting up, covering different areas, calling out coordinates to each other, with the efficiency of people who had done this kind of search before. The casual professionalism in their tone made my skin crawl. This wasn't Jake's first attempt at murder, and it probably wasn't his accomplices either. I was dealing with people who had refined this process, who knew exactly how to make a death in the wilderness look like a tragic accident. The creek began to widen as it flowed toward the valley floor, and the current grew stronger, tugging at my legs with increasing force. I had to grab onto rocks and fallen branches to keep from being swept downstream, my fingers already so numb from the cold that I could barely feel my grip on anything. The lights in the distance seemed closer now, but still impossibly far away for someone in my condition. That's when I heard the sound that changed everything. A dog barking, sharp and urgent, coming from somewhere ahead of me down the creek. Not the casual barking of a pet, but the focused, repetitive sound of a working dog that had found something interesting. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized what this might mean. Search and rescue teams used dogs. If there was an official search happening, if someone had reported me missing, or if Carol had managed to activate her emergency beacon, then help might be closer than I dared to hope. But the barking could also mean that Jake and his accomplices had brought their own dog to track me, that my desperate flight through the creek hadn't been enough to throw them off my scent. I pressed myself against the rocky bank, trying to control my coughing and listen for voices that might tell me whether the dog represented salvation or additional danger. What I heard instead was something that made me dizzy with relief. A woman's voice, calling out official-sounding instructions about search patterns and safety protocols. The authoritative tone of someone trained in wilderness rescue. Someone who represented legitimate help, rather than the men who wanted me dead. I started moving toward the sound as quickly as I could manage, splashing through the increasingly shallow water and calling out in a voice made hoarse by cold and illness. "Help! I'm here! I need help!" The barking intensified, and I could hear the dog crashing through the underbrush toward my location. Within moments, a German shepherd emerged from the trees, followed closely by a woman in official-looking outdoor gear with reflective strips and a radio clipped to her shoulder. She took one look at my condition and immediately began speaking into her radio with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone reporting a medical emergency. "Base, this is Sarah. I've got the missing hiker. Female, early 30s, showing signs of severe hypothermia and respiratory distress. She's been in the water, clothes are soaked, and she's presenting with what looks like pneumonia symptoms. I need immediate medical evacuation to this location." Missing hiker. Someone had reported me missing, which meant people were looking for me, which meant Jake's plan to make my death look like an accident was already falling apart. The relief was so overwhelming that my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the rocky shore, shaking uncontrollably as my body finally began to acknowledge how close I'd come to dying. The search and rescue worker, Sarah, immediately began first aid procedures, wrapping me in an emergency blanket and checking my vital signs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd dealt with hypothermia cases before. Her touch was gentle but urgent, and she kept up a steady stream of reassuring chatter while radiating information about my condition to her team. "Emma, right? That's the name we got from the person who called this in. Emma Chen? You're gonna be okay, but we need to get you warmed up and get some medical attention for that breathing. Can you tell me what happened? How did you get separated from your hiking partner?" The question hit me like cold water, cutting through my relief and reminding me that Jake was still out there, still searching, still dangerous. "He's not my partner," I managed, through chattering teeth. "He's trying to kill me. For insurance money. There are at least 2 of them, maybe 3, and they're armed." Sarah's expression immediately shifted from concerned to alert, and she spoke into her radio again, this time with a different kind of urgency. "Base, be advised that we may be dealing with a criminal situation here. The missing hiker reports that her companion may be attempting to harm her for financial gain. Request immediate law enforcement backup and advise all team members to exercise extreme caution." The response crackled back almost immediately. "Copy that, Sarah. Sheriff's Department has been notified and deputies are en route. Keep the subject secure and maintain situational awareness. Are you in a defensible position?" Sarah looked around at our location, clearly evaluating it from a tactical standpoint rather than just a medical one. We were in a relatively open area beside the creek, with good sight lines in multiple directions but limited cover if someone wanted to approach unseen. "Negative, base. We're exposed here. I'm going to move the subject to the emergency shelter at grid reference 77 Alpha while we wait for evacuation." As she helped me to my feet, supporting most of my weight as we moved away from the creek, Sarah kept asking questions in a low, urgent voice. She wanted to know everything about Jake, about how many people were with him, about what kind of weapons they might have, about any details that could help the other search team members avoid walking into danger. I told her about Carol, about the broken leg and the gun, and the photos she'd taken of the boot prints. Sarah immediately radioed for a second medical team to search for the injured woman while simultaneously requesting that law enforcement treat the scene as a potential crime scene with multiple victims and suspects. The emergency shelter turned out to be a small, weatherproof structure built into a natural depression in the landscape, designed to provide protection for injured hikers while they waited for evacuation. Sarah got me inside and activated a portable heater that began to take the worst edge off the cold that had settled into my bones. The warmth was almost painful after hours of near-freezing temperatures, but it felt like the most luxurious thing I'd ever experienced. "Emma, I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me," Sarah said, checking my pulse and respirations again. Your body temperature is dangerously low, and with the respiratory infection, we need to make sure you don't go into shock. Can you tell me more about this man who was with you? What's his full name? What does he look like? What kind of vehicle was he driving? I forced myself to focus through the fog of exhaustion and hypothermia, giving Sarah all the details I could remember about Jake, his accomplices, and the rental cabin where we'd been staying. She wrote everything down in a waterproof notebook, creating an official record that would be crucial evidence if this situation went to trial. There's something else, I said, remembering Carol's advice about building a case while living through it. I have photos and videos on my phone documenting my condition and the timeline. And there's another phone in my jacket pocket belongs to the injured woman I told you about. She took pictures of boot prints that prove multiple people were involved. Sarah's eyes widened as she examined the evidence I'd managed to preserve. The photos clearly showed my deteriorating condition over the course of the day, with timestamps and GPS coordinates that would be impossible to fake. Carol's documentation of the boot prints was equally compelling, showing clear evidence that at least 3 different people had been moving through the area in a coordinated pattern. This is incredible work, Sarah said, carefully transferring the images to her own device as backup. Most people in your situation wouldn't have thought to document everything like this. It's going to make prosecuting this case much easier. The radio crackled to life with an update that made both of us freeze. All units, be advised that we have 3 male subjects moving in formation approximately half a mile northwest of Sarah's position. They appear to be conducting an organized search and may be armed. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. 3 men. Jake plus 2 accomplices, just as Carol had suspected. They were still looking for me, still trying to complete whatever plan they'd set in motion when they'd brought me up to these mountains. The knowledge that they were so close made my skin crawl, even wrapped in emergency blankets inside a shelter with an armed search and rescue professional. How long until the sheriff's deputies get here? I asked, trying not to let panic creep into my voice. Sarah checked her radio and consulted what looked like a tactical display showing the positions of various team members. 20 minutes, maybe 30 depending on how difficult the terrain is for the vehicles. But Emma, we have other team members in the area, and they're all trained in wilderness law enforcement as well as rescue operations. You're not defenseless here. As if to prove her point, the radio came alive with coordinated communications between multiple search team members who were clearly positioning themselves to observe and contain the men who'd been hunting me. These weren't just volunteer hikers with first aid training. They were professionals with law enforcement experience, tactical communications, and the legal authority to detain suspects. Sarah, this is Marcus. I have visual on the 3 subjects. They're approximately 400 meters from your position and moving in your direction. One of them appears to be carrying what looks like a rifle, and they're all wearing dark clothing with no reflective gear. Definitely not legitimate search and rescue. Copy that, Marcus. Can you maintain visual without being detected? Affirmative. I'm in a concealed position with good sight lines. If they continue on their current heading, they'll pass within 50 meters of my location in about 10 minutes. Sarah looked at me with an expression that was reassuring and terrifying at the same time. Emma, I need you to stay calm and stay quiet. We're going to let them walk into a situation they can't control, and then this nightmare is going to be over. But I wasn't sure it would be that simple. Jake was smart, careful, and experienced at manipulating situations to his advantage. If he realized he was walking into a trap, he might decide that eliminating witnesses was more important than maintaining the pretense of innocence. And if he was desperate enough to attempt murder for insurance money, he might be desperate enough to escalate to violence against law enforcement officers. The next few minutes felt like hours as we listened to the tactical communications between search team members, positioning themselves around the approaching men. Sarah kept monitoring my vital signs and adjusting the heater to combat my hypothermia, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as the situation developed outside our small shelter. All units, subjects have stopped approximately 200 meters northwest of Sarah's position. They appear to be having some kind of discussion or argument. Stand by. The waiting was agony. I could picture Jake out there in the darkness, probably realizing that his carefully planned murder had gone wrong in ways he couldn't control. The official search and rescue operation had turned his isolated killing ground into a crime scene crawling with witnesses and evidence collectors. Even if he managed to find and kill me now, there was no way to make it look like an accident. Sarah, this is base. Sheriff's Department, ETA is now 15 minutes. Deputies are requesting that all team members maintain observation positions and avoid direct contact until law enforcement arrives on scene. Copy that, base. We'll hold position and keep the subject secure. But as Sarah was acknowledging the radio message, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps outside the shelter, moving carefully but deliberately, getting closer with each passing second. Someone had found us, and they were approaching with the kind of stealth that suggested hostile intent rather than rescue operations. Sarah heard it too, and I watched her hand move towards something at her belt that I hadn't noticed before. A sidearm, compact but serious-looking, the kind of weapon that search and rescue professionals carried in areas where they might encounter both dangerous wildlife and dangerous humans. The footsteps stopped just outside the shelter entrance, and for a moment the only sound was my labored breathing and the quiet hum of the portable heater. Then a voice I recognized called out, pitched low but carrying clearly in the cold mountain air. "Emma? Emma, are you in there? It's Jake. Thank God I found you. I've been searching everywhere." The performance was flawless, exactly the tone a worried boyfriend should use when finding his sick girlfriend after hours of desperate searching. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't seen the evidence of his planning and coordination, I might have been fooled by the relief and concern in his voice. Sarah looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly asking whether this was the man I'd been running from. I nodded, and I saw her grip tighten on her weapon as she prepared to handle a situation that had just become much more dangerous. "Emma, I know you're scared and confused, but you're sick, and you need medical attention. Come out so we can get you to a hospital." Still, the perfect performance, the reasonable request that would sound entirely logical to anyone who didn't know what I knew about his intentions. But there was something underneath the concern, a note of impatience or frustration, that suggested his patience with the charade was wearing thin. Sarah made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of responding to Jake directly, she activated her radio and spoke in a voice loud enough to be heard outside the shelter. "Base, this is Sarah. I have the missing hiker secure in the emergency shelter at Grid 77 Alpha. She's hypothermic and requires immediate medical evacuation. Please advise the incoming medical team that we have a potential domestic violence situation and request immediate law enforcement presence at my location." The silence outside the shelter stretched on for what felt like forever. Then Jake's voice came again, but this time the mask had slipped. The concern was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that made my skin crawl. "Sarah, is it? Search and rescue? I'm Jake Morrison, Emma's boyfriend. She's been acting erratically lately, paranoid, making wild accusations. She has a history of mental health issues, and I think the fever might be making her delusional." It was a masterful pivot, the kind of smooth manipulation that Jake specialized in. If I were found dead now, he could claim that I'd been mentally unstable, that my accusations of attempted murder were the product of fever-induced paranoia, that my death had been a tragic accident resulting from my own irrational behavior. But Sarah wasn't buying it. Her voice when she responded was professional but firm, the tone of someone who'd dealt with dangerous men before and wasn't impressed by their manipulations. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the shelter and identify yourself to the law enforcement officers who are en route to this location. The individual under my care has made specific allegations that need to be investigated by the appropriate authorities." "What kind of allegations?" Jake's voice was sharper now, the pretense of concern giving way to something that sounded more like a threat. "Sir, I'm not going to discuss an ongoing investigation with you. Please move away from the shelter and wait for the sheriff's deputies to arrive." That's when I heard the sound that confirmed my worst fears about how desperate Jake had become. The unmistakable sound of a rifle being chambered, a metallic click that carried clearly through the thin walls of our shelter. Sarah drew her sidearm in one fluid motion, positioning herself between me and the shelter entrance while speaking rapidly into her radio. All units, shots may be fired at my location. Suspect is armed with what appears to be a rifle. Requesting immediate backup and medical evacuation. Jake's voice came through the shelter wall one more time, but now all pretense was gone. The mask was completely off, revealing the cold predator underneath. Emma, you stupid bitch. You've ruined everything. 2 years of planning, all the work I put into making you trust me, and you had to go and fuck it all up. The honesty was almost refreshing after months of manipulation and lies. Finally, I was hearing Jake's real voice, the one that revealed exactly what I'd meant to him and what he'd been willing to do to claim my inheritance. Sarah was speaking rapidly into her radio, coordinating with her team members who were moving to surround our position. But I could hear the tension in her voice, the recognition that we were trapped in a small shelter with limited options while a desperate man with a rifle decided whether to cut his losses or go down fighting. The next few minutes would determine whether I survived to testify against the man who'd tried to murder me, or whether Jake's final desperate gamble would succeed in silencing the only witness who could destroy his story. Outside the shelter, I could hear multiple sets of footsteps moving through the forest, and voices calling out instructions in the practiced cadence of law enforcement professionals coordinating a tactical response. Help was coming, but the question was whether it would arrive in time to prevent Jake from making one last attempt to complete the murder he'd planned so carefully. Sarah kept her weapon trained on the shelter entrance while monitoring the radio traffic that would tell us whether we were about to be rescued or whether we were about to find ourselves in the middle of a firefight that could easily claim both our lives. The waiting was unbearable, but it was almost over. One way or another, the next few minutes would determine whether justice would be served or whether Jake Morrison would succeed in getting away with the perfect murder he'd spent 2 years planning. The tension outside our shelter was building to a breaking point when everything exploded into motion at once. I heard Jake's voice rising in anger, shouting something about how I'd destroyed his life, followed immediately by Sarah's sharp command for him to drop his weapon. Then the forest erupted with the sounds of tactical teams moving in from multiple directions, their coordinated approach cutting off any possible escape routes. Drop the weapon! Sheriff's Department, drop the weapon now! The authoritative voices came from at least 3 different positions, creating a crossfire of commands that made it clear Jake was surrounded. Through the thin walls of our shelter, I could hear his panicked breathing, the sound of someone whose carefully planned scheme had collapsed into chaos and who was now facing the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison. Sarah kept her sidearm pointed at the entrance while listening to the tactical communications on her radio. All units. Suspect is contained, but still armed. Civilian and rescue personnel are in the structure directly behind suspect's position. Exercise extreme caution with background fire. Copy that, Sarah. We have clear sight lines and are prepared to neutralize the threat if necessary. The professionalism in their voices was reassuring, but I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized that I was caught in the middle of what could become a deadly confrontation. Jake was desperate, armed, and facing the end of everything he'd worked toward. Men in that position sometimes chose to go out fighting rather than surrender to face justice. Jake Morrison, this is Sheriff's Deputy Williams. You are completely surrounded and have nowhere to go. Put down your weapon and place your hands on your head. Do this now and nobody gets hurt. There was a long moment of silence, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see whether Jake would make the smart choice or the fatal one. When his voice came again, it was full of a bitterness that made my skin crawl. You don't understand, he called out to the deputies. She was supposed to die up here. It was all planned out perfectly. Pneumonia, hypothermia, tragic accident while her loving boyfriend tried desperately to save her. The insurance money, the inheritance, everything was going to be clean and simple. The confession was incredibly stupid from a legal standpoint, but it was exactly what the prosecutors would need to prove premeditation and conspiracy charges. Jake was so angry about his plan falling apart that he was admitting to attempted murder in front of multiple law enforcement witnesses. 2 fucking years I spent playing the devoted boyfriend, he continued, his voice rising to a shout. 2 years of pretending to care about her stupid environmental projects, and her boring friends, and her pathetic attempts to get pregnant. 2 years of listening to her whine about her family and her job and her feelings. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to fake loving someone for that long? Each word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Every moment of tenderness I thought we'd shared, every time I'd believed he cared about me, every intimate conversation where I'd opened my heart to him had been nothing but an elaborate performance designed to position him for murder. The scope of his deception was breathtaking, and the casual cruelty with which he described it made me feel physically sick. Sarah looked at me with an expression of pure rage on behalf of women everywhere who'd been victimized by predators like Jake. "Emma, you need to hear me right now," she said quietly. "None of this is your fault. Nothing you did or didn't do made you deserve this. This man is a sociopath, and you surviving his plan is a victory that's going to save other women from going through what you've been through." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear, but they were interrupted by another outburst from Jake that revealed even more about the scope of his criminal activities. "And it wasn't just her," he screamed at the deputies. "There were 3 others before Emma, all of them perfect setups. All of them ruled accidental deaths, hiking accidents, drowning, carbon monoxide poisoning. I've been doing this for years, and I'm fucking good at it." The confession to multiple murders sent a chill through everyone listening. Sarah's radio immediately came alive with urgent communications as the scope of the investigation expanded beyond a single attempted murder to a potential serial killing spree that had been going on for years. "Base, we need to contact the FBI immediately. Suspect has just confessed to multiple homicides in what appears to be a pattern of targeting women for insurance fraud. This is now a federal case. Copy that, Sarah. FBI field office has been notified, and agents are en route." Deputy Williams tried again to negotiate Jake's surrender, but his tone had shifted now that they were dealing with a confirmed serial killer, rather than just a domestic violence situation. "Jake, you've already said more than enough. The smart thing to do now is put down the weapon and surrender peacefully. You're not walking away from this, but you can choose how it ends." "How it ends?" Jake's laugh was bitter and unhinged. "It ends with me spending the rest of my life in prison while that bitch gets to live off money that should have been mine. It ends with everyone knowing that I was stupid enough to get outsmarted by a sick woman who should have died quietly in the woods like she was supposed to." I could hear movement outside the shelter, careful footsteps repositioning, the sound of professionals preparing for the possibility that negotiation wouldn't work. Sarah was monitoring multiple radio channels now, coordinating not just with the tactical team, but with medical personnel, who were standing by to treat both of us once the situation was resolved. "Emma," Sarah said quietly, "I need you to get as low as possible and cover your ears. This might get loud very quickly." But before I could follow her instructions, Jake made the decision that sealed his fate. Instead of surrendering or trying to negotiate, he chose violence, apparently deciding that if he couldn't have my money, he could at least have the satisfaction of completing my murder. I heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being raised and aimed, followed immediately by Sarah's shouted warning to the tactical team. "He's raising the weapon! He's aiming at the shelter!" What happened next lasted only seconds but felt like an eternity. Multiple gunshots rang out simultaneously, the sharp cracks of law enforcement weapons neutralizing the threat before Jake could fire a single shot. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the mountains, echoing off the rock faces and reverberating through the forest. Then everything went quiet, except for the ringing in my ears and the professional voices of the deputies securing the scene and calling for medical attention. Sarah immediately moved to the shelter entrance, weapons still drawn, confirming with her team that the threat had been eliminated before allowing herself to relax. "Suspect is down and unresponsive," came the report over the radio. "Scene is secure. Medical team can approach safely." Sarah holstered her weapon and immediately turned her attention back to my medical condition, checking my pulse and breathing while updating the incoming medical team on my hypothermia and respiratory distress. But I could barely focus on her words, because the reality of what had just happened was finally sinking in. Jake was dead. The man who'd spent 2 years planning my murder, who'd confessed to killing 3 other women, who'd brought me to these mountains to die, was never going to hurt anyone again. I should have felt relief or satisfaction or some sense of justice being served. Instead, I felt hollow, drained, like I'd been living someone else's nightmare, and was only now waking up to discover what my real life had become. The medical team reached our shelter within minutes, professional paramedics who immediately began treating my hypothermia and monitoring my pneumonia symptoms. They started an IV to get warm fluids into my system and administered oxygen to help with my breathing, all while asking detailed questions about my condition and the timeline of my exposure to the elements. As they worked, law enforcement personnel were processing the scene and beginning the complex investigation that would uncover the full scope of Jake's criminal activities. They found evidence of extensive planning in his personal effects, including detailed maps of the area, communications with his accomplices, and documentation that revealed how he'd researched and targeted his previous victims. The two men who'd been helping him were taken into custody without incident once they realized their leader was dead and their situation was hopeless. Under questioning, they revealed that Jake had been running what amounted to a murder-for-hire operation, targeting women with significant assets and creating elaborate scenarios that would allow him to inherit their money while making their deaths appear accidental. Carol was found and rescued, her broken leg treated, and her testimony adding crucial evidence to the case against Jake's accomplices. The photos she'd taken of the boot prints became key evidence in proving the conspiracy, and her professional assessment of the situation helped investigators understand the sophistication of the operation they were dealing with. As I was loaded onto a stretcher for evacuation to the nearest hospital, Detective Rodriguez from the Sheriff's Department walked alongside, asking gentle but thorough questions about my relationship with Jake and the events that had led to this confrontation. I told her everything I could remember, from the subtle signs that something was wrong to the moment I realized he was trying to kill me. "Emma, I want you to know that your survival and your ability to document what was happening to you has probably saved lives," she said as we reached the medical helicopter that would transport me to safety. Serial killers like Jake Morrison don't stop on their own. They escalate, they get more confident, they target more victims. By fighting back and surviving, you've ended a killing spree that could have gone on for years. The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of medical equipment and concerned voices, paramedics monitoring my vital signs, and radioing ahead to prepare the emergency room for a hypothermia and pneumonia case. But as I watched the mountains recede below us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the absence of fear. For the first time since Jake had first suggested this trip, I wasn't afraid of what he might do next, what lies he might tell, what manipulation he might use to control my perception of reality. He was gone, and with him went the constant underlying tension that had been poisoning my life without me even fully realizing it. The hospital stay lasted 5 days, during which I was treated for severe hypothermia, pneumonia, and the psychological trauma of surviving an attempted murder. The FBI agents who interviewed me were thorough but respectful, building a comprehensive case not just against Jake's accomplices, but against the network of contacts who'd helped him research and target his victims. Rebecca flew out from Seattle the moment she got my message, and having her there made the difference between surviving the experience and truly recovering from it. She helped me understand that the subtle manipulation and emotional abuse I'd experienced over the past 2 years had been just as calculated and deliberate as the murder attempt itself. "Emma, you need to understand that everything he did to you was designed to make you doubt yourself," she said as we sat in my hospital room, looking through the evidence that investigators had collected. "The way he made you feel guilty for not wanting to go hiking when you were sick. The way he dismissed your concerns as paranoia. The way he isolated you from friends and family by making you think you were being unreasonable. That was all part of the setup. The psychological impact was almost harder to process than the physical danger I'd faced. Learning that someone I'd loved and trusted had spent years systematically undermining my confidence and judgment felt like a violation that went deeper than attempted murder. But it also explained so much about why I'd doubted my own instincts, why I'd ignored red flags that should have been obvious, why I'd allowed myself to be manipulated into a situation that nearly cost me my life. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, involving federal charges against Jake's accomplices, investigations into the deaths of his previous victims, and civil proceedings related to the insurance policies and inheritance money that had motivated the crimes. But throughout it all, I had the satisfaction of knowing that justice was being served, and that other potential victims were safe. The inheritance money that Jake had killed for became the foundation for a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women recognize and escape from manipulative relationships. I couldn't bring back the women he'd murdered, but I could use the resources he'd coveted to prevent other women from suffering the same fate. Working with domestic violence experts and law enforcement professionals, we developed educational programs that taught women to recognize the subtle signs of psychological manipulation and financial abuse that often preceded physical violence. We created resources for friends and family members who were concerned about loved ones in potentially dangerous relationships, and we funded research into the psychology of predators who targeted women for financial gain. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying, giving meaning to the trauma I'd survived and creating something positive from an experience that could have destroyed me. Every woman we helped recognize a dangerous situation, every potential victim who escaped before becoming a target, felt like a victory over the man who tried to reduce my life to a dollar amount in an insurance policy. 6 months after that night in the mountains, I stood at the podium of a conference on domestic violence prevention, looking out at an audience of law enforcement professionals, victim advocates, and survivors like myself. The pneumonia was completely healed, the hypothermia was a distant memory, but the lessons I'd learned about trust, manipulation, and survival would stay with me forever. The most important thing I want you to understand, I told the audience, is that the women who die in situations like mine aren't weak or stupid or naive. They're victims of predators who are skilled at psychological manipulation, who spend months or years breaking down their target's ability to recognize danger and trust their own instincts. I talked about the subtle signs that I'd missed or dismissed, the way Jake had systematically isolated me from my support network, the gradual erosion of my confidence that had made me vulnerable to his ultimate plan. But I also talked about the strength it had taken to recognize the danger when it finally became undeniable, the courage required to fight back against someone who seemed to hold all the power. Survival isn't just about physical strength or wilderness skills, I concluded. It's about trusting yourself enough to act on your instincts, even when someone you love is telling you those instincts are wrong. It's about understanding that love should never require you to ignore your own safety or dismiss your own fears. The applause was warm and sustained, but more importantly, I could see in the faces of the audience that the message was resonating. Law enforcement officers were taking notes on warning signs they could watch for. Victim advocates were thinking about new ways to reach women in dangerous situations, and survivors were nodding with recognition, seeing their own experiences reflected in my story. After the presentation, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My boyfriend has been pressuring me to take out a life insurance policy," she said quietly. "He says it's because he loves me, but after hearing your story, I'm starting to think there might be other reasons." I gave her the contact information for our organization's hotline and made sure she had resources for safe housing if she decided she needed to leave. 6 weeks later, she called to tell me that she'd ended the relationship after discovering that her boyfriend had been researching her family's financial situation and had already contacted insurance agents about policies she knew nothing about. That phone call, and dozens of others like it, reminded me why I'd chosen to turn my survival into something that could protect other women. Jake Morrison had tried to reduce me to a victim, a statistic, a tragic accident that would generate money for his bank account. Instead, I'd become something he never could have anticipated, a voice for women everywhere who deserved to be loved for themselves rather than hunted for their assets. The mountains where he'd tried to kill me became a place I visited regularly, not to relive the trauma, but to remind myself of my own strength. I'd walk the easier trails with friends, breathing the clean air and appreciating the beauty that I'd almost been unable to see again. Sometimes I'd think about Carol, the retired detective whose professionalism and courage had helped save my life, and I'd remember that survivors have a responsibility to look out for each other. Jake Morrison spent 2 years planning my death, but he failed to account for the one thing that ultimately defeated him: my refusal to become the victim he needed me to be. In trying to destroy me, he'd made me stronger. In trying to silence me, he'd given me a voice. And in trying to profit from my death, he'd created something that would protect other women for years to come. The nightmares faded with time, but the lessons remained. Trust your instincts. Question the people who ask you to ignore them. And remember that survival is not just about making it through the immediate danger, but about choosing what to do with the life you've saved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.